Hey guys. In our attempt to kind of continue applying sonnets to Taming of the Shrew, I previously read Sonnet 116, but now I'm going to do a little review of Sonnet 116. So I mentioned that Shakespeare's poems, and poems in general, they suffer from this weird who is the writer and who is the speaker of the poem dynamic. And sometimes the speaker of Shakespeare's poems does sound like Shakespeare or someone very close to Shakespeare, close enough that we can kind of round up and say that it's Shakespeare. And other times it doesn't appear to be Shakespeare. There's a lot of poems called the Dark Lady poems, where it seems that Shakespeare's sort of writing as a woman or writing about a woman. Sometimes he seems to be writing as someone in competition with himself. There's a lot of interesting different kind of voices. So essentially, rule number one, who's the speaker of the poem? And I'm looking directly at Sonnet 116, which you have on the sheet in your classroom. It opens with, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments." So there's a difference between the sentences and the lines. The line ends with the word true minds, but the sentence, which is the idea, ends with admit impediments. When you read it, you should kind of read it by sentence, not necessarily by lined end. When you say, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments," don't let me stop something. Don't let me interrupt something. Not that's the joining together of true minds. A lot of times we interpret true minds to be like equals. Love is not love which alters where it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. You saw a lot of punning on moving in Taming of the Shrew in the courtship sequence between Petruchio and Kate. They're sort of toying with one another. And one of the things that he approaches that whole wooing sequence with, and one of the things that is frequently pointed out in the wooing sequence, wooing, such a fun word, he points out that, like, these aren't real men who have previously called her names and said that she's too difficult. Essentially kind of saying they were not man enough for the challenge. And also, he does not gently woo. He doesn't woo like a boy, that he woos like a man. He needs a woman who can take his sort of aggressive method of courtship. Love does not change what it finds, even though love changes us. So love is not love which alters where it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. It doesn't seek to change people. It changes them, but it doesn't seek to change the one that they love. Oh no, with even an exclamation mark. Such like a modern phrase, too, something that hasn't died out or changed much in 500 years. It is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. Tempests are storms. Love is an ever-fixed mark. It is something that doesn't change. It stays the same. I think about it, the mental image is like the rocks that line the beach, like the big rocky crags. Like, no matter how shallow the beach gets from the storm, those rocks don't move. They might get swept with water, they might get drowned, but they don't move. It is the star to every wandering bark. So before you had GPS, you would find your way with stars. Something kind of interesting, like the wandering bark, the people who are in different places. Sometimes I think of bark there as really referencing trees. So in London, it's not like you have a plethora of trees, but one other method for finding your way when you're traveling is to look for moss on trees. There's a Boy Scout somewhere who will correct me, but I believe moss only grows on the southern side of trees, something to do with light. There's a way to Google this, but there were ways to navigate, and some are less trustworthy than others, but the stars are always in the same position. You can navigate quite clearly by the stars. So that, in other words, love becomes a more secure point of navigating your life or your love. Love is the thing that is concrete. And if it's good, if it's real, if it's a marriage of true minds. Whose worth unknown, though his height be taken. So that's sort of a clever way of saying you might know what someone is worth, like the money that they're worth, which is like the height that you take. You can measure something like liquid asset. You can measure how much value someone brings to your marriage, but you don't really know how much they're worth to you. You don't know the value of another person outside of things like that. So even in Shakespeare's time, I said their primary impetus behind marrying was often very business driven, but that didn't mean that they didn't see the social or emotional impact of love. Like they would have wanted marriages to evolve into loving marriages. You might not be able to predict that value to your life or your family, even if you could predict other things. Love's not time's fool. Though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come, love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but it bears out even to the edge of doom. That is an entire thought, and one that's translates well, I think, even if the phrasing is very dated. So essentially, love is not something so fleeting that time can break it, even though time necessarily changes us. Like you're not always going to be the young, beautiful thing that someone loved, but that love essentially remains the same, even if the person you love looks different over time. I have more gray hair now. I don't know if you can see it in this light, than I did when I met my husband. And my figure certainly is not the same after 2 children. My sense of makeup is much improved. So older pictures of me, I actually look older, but I'm not going to get younger, and I'm not going to get thinner. I'm not going to get like more fit. I'm going to be old and fat and wrinkly one day. Those things go away with time, but the other things that make up your marriage don't. The other things that make up what you love about a person don't change. And that's the sentiment that Shakespeare is communicating. Time can't really do much to corrupt true love. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. So I told you that sonnets usually have a format to them, and there's a pivot or a shift or a change. And they're grouped either in 8 and 6 or 12 and 2, because there's always 14 lines. This is a 12 and 2. Some people might say that because there's a sentence break on the 7th sentence or on the 8th sentence that it's an 8 and 6. I would say that it's a 12 and 2 because he has the if on the 11th line. So if this be error, if all that he has just said about love is wrong, then I clearly have never written anything and no one's ever truly been in love. If this is not how love works, then clearly we don't know anything. And clearly I am no poet and I am no writer and I don't know anything. It's a little bit of an ironic turn, tiny bit, because clearly he's a writer and clearly he's a poet and clearly he's a wordsmith and clearly he knows what he's saying and clearly he's right. So it's a very obvious method of going like, if I'm wrong, which we know I'm not, I guess discredit me, ignore me. But we can't, right? For many reasons, not the least of which is he's clearly the writer. You can't unwrite this poem. It's already been written by the 12th line. So there's something very stern or very steady at any rate, if not stern, very steady and very concrete in how he ends by saying that this is definitely how love actually is. He's not really saying that he invites you to disprove him. He's sort of saying you can't disprove him. Consider how he talks about love and marriage, because he thinks that the marriage of true minds is kind of ultimately where we should get, right? We might not start there, but we should get there. It is the goal. How do you think about this when you think about marriages? In Taming, you are setting yourself up for 2 sets of marriages, Petruchio and Kate, and Bianca and whoever she chooses. We're all rooting Lucentio. How do you foresee their meeting of the minds? Are they like-minded? Are they not like-minded? Who has the upper hand? Who doesn't have the upper hand? Are they going to be marriages that age well? Or are they going to be marriages that age poorly? More on this in our assignment today. See you guys later.